So the next thing that I'd like to show you about screening is the whole idea that once somebody has had the test, they've had this screening test, that individual person is going to either have a positive result of the screening test or a negative result of the screening test. So you're going to get the results from your doctor or healthcare provider or whoever it is that screened you with this rapid, inexpensive, dangerous test, and they're going to say, oh my goodness, you had a negative test result, or oh my goodness, you had a positive test result. And what we want to do is we want to think about what that result means. And the way we do that is by thinking about this whole population. Let's say here we have 200 people that were screened. 100 of them just so happened to have the disease and 100 of them didn't. We're going to go with these red numbers down here. And so, but if we look at it from the perspective of this screening test, it looks like we had 95 people who had a positive result, and we had 105 that had a negative screening test result. Remember, this is screening, this is not the confirmatory test. And so we want to know something about the screening test. We want to know how good these results actually predict something about that particular person. Now, when we do the screening test, we simply know that there are 95 of them that are positive. We do not know which are the 5 and which are the 90. And it's only when we do this over time and we compare those results after we do the confirmatory testing and find out if they ended up being a yes or a no, that we have the kind of results that we're going to be using for what I'm going to show you right now. And so this confirmatory test will tell us, oh yes, they did actually have disease, or no, they didn't. But the screening test, all we know is that there are 95 and 105. And so the next two concepts that I want to show you are something called positive and negative predictive value. And I'm going to call them PPV. Another way of saying that is the predictive value of a positive test or positive screening test. For negative predictive value, the other way of saying that is the predictive value of a negative test. And depends on where you look in the literature, you'll see PPV and NPV, but then sort of in the more formal research arena, you'll be much more likely to see PV positive and PV negative. And the way I like to say this in my head is to say the predictive value of a positive screening test, or the predictive value of a negative screening test. And so let me explain exactly what I mean by those. Basically, if I have let me find a different color. If I have a screening test that's positive, I would want those, see, I'm working backwards here, I would want those people to also be the ones that have disease. Is that not correct? So if somebody has a positive test, I would want that to mean that they have the disease. They have that preclinical manifestation that we are able to detect, the detectable preclinical phase. That's what we mean. We want this to be valid. We want the results to mean what they mean. So the predictive value of a positive test means that of those who have a positive screening test, what percent actually had disease? And so let me draw that as an equation. So of those with a positive screen test, how many are with disease? I'm going to scoot over here just a little bit. And so the total number of people with a positive screening test in this case is 95. And what proportion of those are with disease? Well, we look in this with disease column and we find out that there are 90 of them. And so we have 90 out of 95. And so you could calculate that and actually come up with, a percentage, some percent. On the flip side then, we have this negative predictive value, or the predictive value of a negative screening test. So here's our negative screening test. There are 105 of them. And so what we mean by that is, of those that have a negative screening test, what percent are without disease? So of those with a negative screen test, what proportion are without disease? So here we're just looking at this whole concept of validity going backwards. Now I want you to notice something. I use this word of a lot, or among those. Anytime you see a sentence in English, you can dissect that by just seeing of who. Is it of those without disease? Then they're talking about specificity. If you're talking about of those with a negative screening test, then you're talking about negative predictive value. In other words, of those with a negative screening test, what percentage of the time were we right? What percentage of the time did we come to the right conclusion? And so in this case, of those with a negative screening test, there were 105 of them. And what percent do not have disease? That's our number 95. Now, one thing that I want you to notice is, and so, well, let me go back to that. Let me finish that thought. That will end up with a something percent. So you're going to have to calculate that out. So you can do 95 out of 105. One thing that I want to point out is that this cell in the bottom, and I'll try to draw it with a really heavy line, this is the part of the time that they were right. That person did not have disease, and we got a negative screening test. Also in this top left corner, these were also the ones we were right. These people did have disease. They're the yeses. And we matched them up with a positive screening test. What that means is that these corners in the bottom left and the top right, these are the times that we were wrong. The screening test was incorrect. It was invalid for that particular person. And so I want to point out, let me draw this in black, this top left corner, the screening test was positive and it was correct, so we call these true positives. In this bottom right hand corner, the screening test was negative and they were also correct, so we call these true negatives. Now here's the part where people get confused, and so I want to give you a clue about how to remember this. On the top here, the screening test was positive, and so you need to put a positive in both of these cells for this row. This top row, they were positive. The left-hand side, they were true, they were correct. However, over here on the right-hand side, they were wrong. The screening test was wrong, and so those are called false positives. In other words, the screening test was positive, but it was incorrect. Similarly, over here on this bottom half of the table, these were negative screening test results, and so hence the true negative. This one is also negative, but this is where they were wrong. It's a false negative. Now people get these confused. This top right corner and this bottom right corner, they say false, but then they use the wrong word to go with it. So in this particular case, the top rows are positive, and so this is a false positive. The bottom row is negative, and so this is where your false negatives are. So don't get those confused. In other words, the test was negative, but they were wrong. And so that's this little percentage of the time where the prediction, this predictive value, was incorrect. And so we ended up with the wrong conclusion for that specific person. Now, the danger in that, and this is one of the most important things that you can take away from this particular lecture. If a person has a negative screening test, and so I'm going to highlight this in kind of like this whole entire row in blue. If a person has a negative screening test, what do we tell them? Yippee! Your test was negative, right? Go on your way, keep doing what you're doing, all is well, you don't need to worry about a thing, and they're like, oh, okay, I'm good. So if they are one of these people that's a false negative, they get the impression that they don't need to change. They don't need to make any, they don't need to, they don't need to do anything different in their life. They don't need to have a vaccination. They don't need to change their health habits. They get this false sense of security, and so that can be dangerous, giving people who do have disease what's essentially feels like a clean bill of health. That's a problem. And so we've just told people that everything is okay, and now they're not going to be worried about it. The flip side is also problematic, where here we have people, and this top section, I should do it in a different color, let's do it in red. So this top section, they came back with a positive screening test, and we say, oh dear, you have a positive screening test, you need to go on and have confirmatory testing. And the problem with the good thing and the bad thing about confirmatory testing is that it's designed to confirm, and so it's usually more complex, it's usually more expensive, it does have some risks associated. In the meantime, while a person is waiting, they have a lot of anxiety about, do I have the disease or not? Sometimes these are very serious diseases like cancer or infectious diseases that people are very concerned about. And so if you have a person with a false positive, they spend all this anxiety between the time of their screening test and their confirmatory test, and all the pain and money and possibly risk associated with that confirmatory test, and they didn't have the disease in the first place. They were negatives. And so we want to actually minimize both of these groups. Now the problem comes is that, and you'll see this later, is that there's a trade-off. And so we need to do our best to figure out how to keep those numbers to a minimum, but we have to often decide with the screening test part of it is which one is the worst case. Is it worse to have false negatives where a person actually has disease but our screening test did not pick it up? Or is it worse to have false positives? A person does not have disease, but they go through all the anxiety of getting to this confirmatory testing. Very many people would say that the false negatives, let me find a new color because I'm scribbling, the false negatives are worse. The screening test, we should do our very, very, very best to try to pick up on all of these people, or at least the vast majority of them. We should try our hardest to try to capture. It's kind of like casting the net wide and find all of the potential people that have the disease. If we have a few false positives, then the confirmatory test will help us to diminish that number back to only the people who truly have the disease. But we don't want to miss the ones that do have disease. So that's where often screening tests lean, is that they tend to want to really, really minimize their false negatives, but that sometimes will increase the false positives. So that concludes my talk on positive and negative predictive value. Next, we will move on to the next part of screening.